The Termination Bureau. The nurses moved systematically through the incubator, giving bottles, changing diapers, checking charts, writing notes, when suddenly the door swung open. All eyes turned to the man walking in. His stature cleared the doorway. His hair meticulously brushed to the side. Even his mustache had been combed to a T. His uniform looked freshly pressed, down to the creases in his pants. The golden badge upon his chest glimmered in the light. A slim baton was tucked into his belt on his left, pepper spray on his right. The nurses straightened, standing at attention. "I need 3 more," he said to no one in particular. One nurse quickly went into action, gathering 3 babies and their files onto her cart and wheeling them eagerly to the officer. "Here you go, sir," she said. 3 babies ready to go." She gave him a curtsy, brushing a few loose strands of hair behind her ear. "Thank you, Miss Susan," said the officer with a wink. Nurse Susan couldn't help but smile, her shoulders swaying from side to side. "You're welcome, Officer Tommy," she said softly as he opened the door leading back to the room he had entered from. The other nurses walked up to Nurse Susan's side. "That man is such a hunk," said one. "A real hero," said another. Nurse Susan nodded, letting out a deep, wanting sigh as she did. Against the back wall of the white room stood 26 podiums. Like the walls, these podiums were painted daily with a fresh coat of white. But as the working day progressed, if one looked close enough, they would see several faint drippings of a red substance upon them. Atop each podium was a tray about 3 feet in width, enclosed with thick, bulletproof glass, though the front of the trays remained open. All had a baby on them, except for 3. Officer Tommy located these empty podiums and placed a baby atop their empty tray. The collective sound of 26 babies crying was piercing. But Officer Tommy was used to it by then. He had worked in that particular office for several years, and many more years in an office in Alabama, so he hardly even noticed the noise anymore. Once he had confirmed that all of the babies were securely on a tray, he collected their files from the cart and sat behind his desk on the opposite side of the room. He took his thermos of black coffee and had a small sip. The coffee was lukewarm, but he preferred it that way. It was a sign of a hard day's work. He opened the file of the first baby and carefully looked over its information. A birth certificate, some information on the baby's birth parents, an application for termination, a couple of recommendations, an approval letter from the moral advisor assigned the case, a signed declaration of release, the results from the baby's examinations, and so on. Once satisfied, he moved on to the next file. As Officer Tommy looked over the files, he could see the waiting room full of patients both young and old through the window on the eastern wall. Each patient had their reason for being there that day, all rehearsing those reasons in their heads as they waited their turn. Whenever the door to the waiting room opened, the room went immediately quiet, every whisper hushing. All eyes turned toward the door at the secretary standing there, hoping their name would finally be called, wanting nothing more than to get this horrible, regretful day over with. "Jocelyn Adams," said the secretary. "That's me," a nervous voice said. A 13-year-old girl stood, her big, pregnant belly nearly knocked over the little kids playing in front of her. She stepped over a couple of babies as she made her way to the door. "Excuse me," she said. "Excuse me." The secretary looked her up and down disgustedly as she watched this little kid approach her. She said. "Follow me." And so Jocelyn Adams followed her to the back. The door closed, and the waiting room once more filled with whispers, this time about the pregnant little girl. Officer Tommy concluded that all the paperwork was in order, so he stood and made his way to the safes across the way, 12 in total, 1 for each officer on staff. The safes were lined up just below the window looking into the waiting room. For a moment, Officer Tommy studied the faces inside. The tears, the pain, the hopelessness, the nervousness, the shame. Then he waved with a smile. But the patients did not wave back. Still with a smile, Officer Tommy knelt before his personal safe, entered his combination into the padlock, and opened it carefully. He looked through every gun inside before choosing his favorite. Then he filled his magazine with 26 bullets. The secretary showed Jocelyn Adams to office number 3, where inside sat the moral advisor assigned her case. He was a tall man, a slender man, an old man, with a thick mustache as white as his skin. "Sit," he said, without looking up. His voice was deep, commanding, and everything but welcoming. Jocelyn sat in the chair across from him. She grabbed her application from her ripped-up backpack, setting it gently on the table. The application took all of the night prior to fill out. She had done so quietly, with her room lights off and only the light from her phone to guide her. The moral advisor drew the papers closer to him. He placed a pair of half-moon reading glasses over his eyes. Jocelyn tapped her toes anxiously as she watched him flip a page. She wiped sweat from her brow with her shirt sleeves. A minute later, he turned another page. Her head started to pound. The fetus swayed inside. A few pages later, the moral advisor stopped suddenly. He removed his reading glasses and looked up at Jocelyn. "It seems," he said, "you have neglected to get the signature from the man who has impregnated you. According to the law here in the state of Florida, a pregnant girl or a woman is not permitted to sell her baby without written permission from the man who impregnated her. I am afraid I cannot approve your application." "But sir," said Jocelyn, "you see..." She stopped. A tear rolled down her cheek. She averted her eyes from the moral advisor, whose judgment was piercing her skin. She found a nice piece of carpet below to focus on instead. "You see," she continued, "the man who impregnated me is... well, it was my father, and he refuses to sign." The moral advisor grabbed the handbook from the shelf behind his desk. He flipped through the pages with familiarity. When he found the page he needed, he turned the book to Jocelyn and pointed at the 7th line on the left page. As she looked at the words, the moral advisor rehearsed them from memory. "It matters not who the man is, whether he be a blood relative, a rapist, a liberal, an atheist, a retard, or all of the above. If he is an American citizen, then it is his right to choose what becomes of his unborn child. The woman he impregnates is simply the carrier of his property, not the owner or decider of what happens to it." Jocelyn looked up at the moral advisor, stunned. "Is your father an American citizen?" he asked her. "He is," she said numbly. "Well, in that case," said the moral advisor, taking his red stamp and slapping it on the front of her application, "your application is hereby been denied by the state of Florida. And as the law requires for an impregnated woman, your baby must be carried to term and taken care of until the age of 18. Or else, you will be sentenced to life in prison for the destruction or neglect of another man's property." "But sir," Jocelyn cried, "I cannot raise this child." The pounding in her head worsened. The fetus no longer swayed, but rocked. "Then you should have thought of that before you went and got yourself pregnant, my dear," said the moral advisor, standing up from his chair. "I didn't ask to get pregnant," she screamed. "Miss, I have other patients to see." When Jocelyn refused to move, he grabbed her by her shoulders and shoved her out of his office, along with her backpack. Then he returned to his desk and pressed the button that called his secretary. "Hold my next patient," he said. "I have to make a quick call." Officer Tommy got into position in front of the first podium. He lifted the ocular lens to his right eye and ensured the baby's head was in sight. According to the documentation, this particular baby had been placed into the care of the state of Florida by a married couple who attended the same church as Officer Tommy. In their application, they stated that, after many nights of prayer, it had been revealed to them that God had not willed this baby to be part of their family after all, and that God had told them it would be best to instead sell it to the state, so that it could go to wherever it was that God willed it to go. The moral advisor assigned the case, someone who just so happened to believe in the same God as the patients believed in, approved this application almost instantaneously. "God's will be done," the moral advisor wrote in the notes. While the biological parents returned home after the birth of the baby remained in the hospital for several weeks, where the state of Florida ran multiple examinations to determine statistical likeliness that it would grow up to be a helpful servant of the state. Every baby sold to the state went through these same tests. As a result of these tests, most were sent to various facilities around the state or sold to private organizations around the nation. Those who tested high in intellectual potential were sent to academies that specialized in science, technology, and weaponry. The babies who tested high in muscular potential were sent to academies that specialized in physical labor. The babies testing high in loyalty and obedience were often sold to private organizations or the federal government for placement in the U.S. military. But every now and then, a baby failed to test high in any significant category and was determined statistically useless to the state, the federal government, and all private organizations. This, the baby born to Officer Tommy's churchmates, just so happened to be one of those babies. Officer Tommy blinked away the thoughts of his fellow churchgoers. Again, he focused on the baby across from him. He exhaled slowly, emptying his lungs, steadying his body, then held his breath as he pulled the trigger. And just like that, the crying decreased by one. In the alleyway behind the Termination Bureau, Jocelyn Adams grabbed the metal hanger that she had hidden before going inside. She had hoped she would not have needed to use it. She had hoped the moral advisor would have heard out her predicament, that her application would have been approved despite the missing signature. She had hoped. But she had no more hope left to feel. She had to use the hanger. So she hid herself against the wall, in the shadows, away from the cameras, and carefully untwisted the hanger. She pulled the metal wire into a straight line. She looked around one last time. No. There was nobody near, and no cameras in sight to catch her. She carefully took off her pants, followed by her underwear. All the while, leaning against the dumpster, she closed her eyes and inserted the wire inside herself in the same forceful way her father often entered her. Even through the pain and discomfort, she continued to force the hanger deeper, just as she had seen in the video she had studied the night before. Tears poured down her cheeks as she scrambled the hanger to the left and right, up and down, side to side, until blood began to ooze out of her and onto her hand. She dropped the hanger, falling to her knees. The blood continued to flow. She cried out in pain and guilt and sadness and hopelessness. After all 26 targets inside the White Room had been terminated, Officer Tommy carefully disassembled his gun and returned it to his safe. As he closed the door and locked the safe, he looked through the window into the waiting room. They were no longer talking. Just about all of the eyes were on the drops of blood behind him. He smiled and waved, but received no response. So he then turned back to his desk, grabbed 26 report forms from his filing cabinet, and filled them out one at a time. Once all were completed, he placed the forms in their proper folders. He then tidied his desk. He stacked the folders, returned his pen to its holder, wiped away a smudge formed by his elbow, and took another sip of lukewarm coffee. He then gathered the folders and took them to an adjacent room, where several desks were stationed. He approached his secretary and set the folders gently on the table in front of her. He then leaned over and whispered something into her ear that only she could hear. She blushed. She laughed. She bit her lower lip as she responded, and she did not push his encroaching hand away as it rubbed up and down her leg. He then grabbed some water from a nearby cooler, checked in on a moral advisor friend of his, entered $3 into the vending machine for a bag of chips, and pocketed for later. Then he strolled back to the incubator, whistling joyfully as he did. "Nurses, I'm ready for the next group." It took no more than 5 minutes for police cars to fill the alleyway behind the Termination Bureau. For as soon as Jocelyn Adams left his office, the moral advisor called to let them know an act of murder was likely to be taking place in the alleyway. He told them to hurry, that there was still time to stop it, still time to save a life, though the life he was concerned for was only of the unborn. A life already started meant nothing to him. Jocelyn had yet to pull up her pants by the time the police arrived. She was just lying there in a pool of her own blood, crying. The officers didn't bother to locate her missing pants. Instead, one police officer took her arms and roughly put them behind her back as his partner put his knees into her side. "Stay down!" they yelled at her. "Stay down!" Another officer aimed his gun at her head, just in case she refused to listen. He kept his finger on the trigger. When she had been cuffed, they dragged her to the nearest car and threw her into the back seat, leaving behind a trail of blood. With sirens playing in the background, Nurse Susan made her way around the incubator as Officer Tommy watched her from the doorway to the White Room, which became less and less white as the day went on.